Hi everybody. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the colonial system and the way that it functioned on the ground. This is to complement and supplement what you're reading in Restall and Lane. One of the big questions this unit is going to explore is how did Spain and Portugal control the colonies in the Americas, considering the distance between them? In fact, just to give you a sense of what that distance looks like, a fleet sent to Spain from the Americas might not return for 14 to 15 months. It took twice as long to get from the Americas to Europe than vice versa, right? So how did the Spanish crown and the Portuguese crown control the vast territories of the Americas? That's what we're going to focus today. So one of the main arguments I want to make is that the project of colonization was critically a money-making scheme. Religion was certainly part of it, but Spain and Portugal were in this to make money. To make money, they needed to pay off their debts. And in this, they were very lucky. They happened upon a region of the world that was incredibly wealthy in terms of natural resources. To make good on their investment, the Iberian empires set up a whole bureaucratic system that would maintain their control over the Americas and maximize their profits. In so doing, they set the foundations for centuries of exploitative economic relations between Latin America and Europe, and these economic relationships themselves were built on the backs of indigenous and African slave labor. And that's what we're going to talk about in the weeks to come. So today, I just want to give you an overview of what the colonial system looks like. So the Spanish Empire, the Spanish economy was based on a mercantilist system. A mercantilist system simply means that in such a system, the power and prestige of the state is measured on the basis of the gold and silver reserves, or the gold and silver that state holds. So Spain, during this period, needed to build up the supply of gold and silver, not just because that was how they measured power and prestige, but also because Spain was deeply in debt as a result of the Reconquista. Lucky for Spain, the Americas were incredibly rich in valuable exportable goods. So let's just talk about gold. Colombia, the region that we know as Colombia, shipped 4 million ounces of gold by 1600 to Spain, and by the 18th century, they were shipping 30 million ounces of gold. In terms of silver, between 1503 and 1600, 35 million pounds of silver were sent to a single Spanish port. The silver mines of Potosí alone produced 100,000 tons of silver. In terms of sugar, this incredibly labor-intensive crop, every year Brazil sent 40 to 50 ships full of sugar to Europe. Latin America was also home and rich in trees, the material to make cloths, dyes, etc., that were in really high demand in Europe. But here becomes the issue. So Latin America has this immense natural wealth. How is the crown going to profit off of that? So primarily through taxation, right? The royal fifth. 20%, for example, of all silver mined had to go back to the crown. The crown also held monopolies on crucial industries like mercury that were needed to extract silver. In order to maximize profits, the Spanish crown was also very, very heavily involved in the economies of the New World. For one, they made sure that the colonies could only purchase from Spain. They could legally only trade with Spain, and legally with only one port in Seville. For a long time, they only allowed trade to leave the Americas for Spain from 3 ports in the New World. The crown ensured access to labor so that to maximize profits. And then the crown monitored the production and commerce going on in the colonies. But the question is, how could they do that, right? They're so far away. How could the royal crown maintain this level of control? Well, they set up a system of government that was primarily focused on 3 things: overseeing the crown's financial and political interests in the New World, providing a justice system, and allocating resources and taxation. And they set all that up by 1535. So let's look at what that looks like. Remember, Spain at this time is ruled by the Habsburg king and queen, Isabel and Ferdinand. But Spain is thousands of miles away, and they have many territories to control. So they create the Council of the Indies, which is going to oversee the colonies and all of the government activity there. The Council of the Indies is a really interesting body. It has legislative, judicial, financial, commercial, military, and even ecclesiastical functions. They issue laws, they approve budgets, hear cases, do inspections. The counselors themselves are educated Spaniards. They don't have much experience in the Americas, and they're based out of Spain. So they don't have anyone on the ground. So they need someone on the ground, And who that person is going to be is the viceroy. The viceroy is the king's representative in the New World. So we might think of viceroys essentially as governors. They're responsible for the general administration of the viceroyalty, of the territory they're in charge of. They're responsible for public works, for order, for protecting indigenous people. They serve for 6 to 7 years, and nearly all of them were born in Spain. There's a lot of discrimination during the colonial period against people born in the Americas, including Europeans born in the Americas. Viceroyals, much like other public officials, freely use their position to benefit their family. And at first there are only 2 viceroyalties, the one in New Spain and the one in Peru. But later there will be more, and there's going to be a map on a PowerPoint slide that you should check out. The viceroyalties themselves are divided into smaller groups known as audiencias. These tended to center on major cities, and they were regions where a royal court had jurisdiction. Audiencias were divided into provinces, and then below provinces there were municipal governments that were led by town councils or cabildos. But here's where things get just a little confusing. There were actually a parallel system of government at the city level. There was a Spanish cabildo and an indigenous cabildo, and each was responsible for distributing land, public works, criminal justice, etc. But the indigenous politicians had the added burden of collecting tribute, assembling workers for the labor drafts, and protecting their communities from excessive exploitation. And Rustall and Lane and other historians have argued that it's the indigenous politicians who were key to the survival of the colonial system and of the indigenous community. As you do the reading, I want you to think about that argument and how they helped ensure both the survival of the colonial system and of their community. These politicians often came from indigenous elite families. They're known as curacas or caciques, and they could be men or women. So the point in detailing this for you is that the Spanish state in the New World is very, very bureaucratic. At the top are a handful of Spaniards, born in Spain, who serve as royal officials. They oversaw Spanish settlers, their Creole descendants, and then the large mass of indigenous people who were actually producing the wealth, and also who were actually producing the wealth. In this system, corruption was rampant. These public positions, were paid very little, and so public officials felt that they could and had to supplement their income. Later, during the colonial era, the crown is actually going to sell these positions to raise money, and it was tacitly understood that the new officials were going to recoup their investment. So in this period, this kind of corruption, it wasn't viewed as corruption. To the crown, it was just another way of preserving loyalty, of making sure that elite interests aligned with the crown interests. So bureaucrats use their position to get rich, to skim a little bit off the top of taxes and tribute. They took bribes or gifts from local businessmen, ranchers who wanted favors, in the form of indigenous labor or other things. But this system, you can expect that it would have some problems, right? There was a lot of room for abuse, and there was a lot of room for incompetence, but it did ensure that elite interests became the state's interests, and they protected each other. They protected their own interests and not those of the masses. This would mean that there would be little conflict between local elites and the crown, but it meant that the potential for abuse would be very high. And we'll talk more specifically about that in the weeks to come. So scholars used to think of the Spanish Empire as this tightly knit, highly centralized system. But in recent years, studies of piracy and of government bureaucracy have shown that really the Spanish Empire was a loose collection of territories held together by different bodies of power. The crown and its bureaucrats, and then the church. And we'll talk more about the church again in the weeks to come. In fact, one scholar says it might be helpful if we think of the Spanish Empire as several wheels. So there's one wheel where the crown is at the center and the spokes are the audiencias, but there are other wheels where the audiencia is at the center and the provinces are the spokes. And so it's a very decentralized system. How well did it work? Well, it lasted 300 years. But as the empire expanded, it grew costly and very inefficient. One example of that is the issue of piracy and monopolies. So I told you earlier that in their zeal to protect profits, the crown created monopolies and made it so that the colonies could only legally trade with Spain. But this gave rise to a booming illicit trade. 2/3 of all trade in this period was illegal or contraband. The crown's policies created a lot of resentment from other countries who wanted access to the markets in the Americas, and this would lead to war. It also created resentment in the Americas among peninsulares, the people born in the peninsula who went to live in the Americas, and criollos, Europeans born in the Americas, who resented the discrimination they faced and who resented the limits placed on them for purchasing and selling. So let me just give you one concrete example of what that looked like. To protect the gold and silver that was coming from the New World to Europe, Spain would send these huge fleets twice a year. And they would come loaded with goods to sell, and then they would go back full of gold and silver. So for the people in the Americas, it meant that shopping really only came once or twice a year. And they had to pay very, very high prices for imported goods, and they also lost money because they could only sell to Spain. So this is the beginnings of some cracks that we're going to see in the way that the colonial system operated. Again, in the weeks to come, we'll also talk more about how this system is based on the labor of indigenous people and Africans. But the system I described today was incredibly complex and yet also very flexible. It allowed for a great deal of flexibility and autonomy, especially at the lower levels. This government structure, though, is really important for explaining how the colonies work and why they ultimately break down. And next week, or the week after spring break, we'll talk more about the economics and the economies of the empire, as well as the role of the Catholic